Assalamualaikum everyone. Thank you for joining our Know Your Right series. Today, our topic for today is navigating human resources and how to, just echoing. How to follow up workplace complaints and disputes. The guest speaker for today is Joshua G. Miller. He is a labor and employment attorney at the Furnace Law Firm, and our board member, Huma Shah. The floor is yours, Joshua.
All right. Thanks for letting me come to speak today. I just want to give a general overview of some of the pitfalls that people encounter when they're dealing with HR. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the first problem with HR is that they're not really there to protect the employees as much as they're there to protect the company. And depending on the size of your company, you may not even have a formal HR department. So there are a number of federal laws and state laws that apply to employment discrimination, illegal employment practices, and it really depends on the size of your company. If you have fewer than 6 employees, then the Missouri Human Rights Act is not going to apply to you. If you have fewer than 12, I believe, then the Title 7 isn't necessarily going to apply to you. That's a federal law. There are other laws, though, that will. There's a Section 1981 dealing with race discrimination. There are, depending on the number of employees and how long you've actually been in a company, there's also Family Medical Leave Act. So there's a number of different ways that an employer can do something wrong. And the important thing to do is recognize, one, if you feel like something's wrong, it probably is, but now what? Now that something bad has happened, what do I do? The first thing that you want to do is you want to know if your employer has a policy. A lot of times when you're brought on board with a company, they'll have an orientation period where they'll throw a big, thick piece of, a big manual at you, and oftentimes you'd be like, sign this, I read it. Read it. That's number one. Read it, see if you can get a copy of it, because there is important information about sick time, and if they have benefits, and if they have a discipline policy, and also included in that there should be some section that deals with discrimination, whether it be based on age, race, gender, religion, disability, and they will say, okay, we have these policies. So it's good, one, to know, if they do actually have policies governing that, they should. And two, what are the steps that you need to do to communicate to the company, give the company notice that you have an issue, because that's really what it's about. If you have a problem with the company and you start to notice that you're not getting anywhere with, like, let's say they say talk to your manager, you're not getting anywhere with your manager, you need to immediately figure out who the next higher person is that you talk to. We often call this escalating it. You need to escalate that to the next person. And it's important that you keep some kind of record of it. So if you have a meeting with HR, follow up with an email. Today we discussed so-and-so, did this, that, or the other, or this is happening to me. This is the steps that you propose moving forward. And we agreed that we would in an X amount of time to follow up. Something so that it encapsulates or captures the what happened in the meeting, to show that there's a record of it, because you're doing two things. One, you're telling the employer that, hey, I know that something is not right and you're supposed to make it right. And what you're also doing is you're creating what we call notice to the employer. Now, most people would rather have a job than a case. So you don't, it's not that you're necessarily thinking, oh, I'm going to sue right away. That's not what we're trying to talk about really at this meeting today. What we're talking about is how you get to the point where you don't have to sue, how you get to the point where HR should be doing what to do. And the problem that a lot of employees face is, one, either not following up with HR or not jumping through the specific hoops that HR states, and also not trusting that the company is paying attention when they're really not, trusting that they're following up when they're really not. So what you want to do is you want to create sort of a timeline, document what happens. A lot of times it'll be things that in and of itself won't necessarily make you think, oh, that's not right. I mean, because there's a sort of a difference between an everyday sort of petty annoyance in a work, and that's kind of how the law looks at it, like, unfortunately, and things that are protected under the law. So if you start to notice that you're having an issue maybe with a coworker, you need to go to your supervisor and say, hey, this feels kind of weird, bringing this up, but, so-and-so is, giving me a lot of pushback. And I noticed that she doesn't give other people pushback. Is there something that I can do to, kind of, make sure that I'm understanding what I need to do to, do my job? Because if you're showing that, hey, I'm here to learn, I'm here to do my job, I'm interested in sort of an honest day's pay for an honest day's work, if that's your attitude, then a lot of times the company will be, okay, well, let's try to fix this problem. And what you don't want to be seen in as is a problem child, because for right or wrong, it's sort of like if you stand out, the more you stand out and the more you create a problem for the company, they do sort of an internal calculus where it's sort of like, okay, what's it going to cost to deal with this versus what's it going to cost to let them go? And a lot of times the discussion on the back end is like, hey, so-and-so has brought this to my attention. And the first thing that any defense attorney or any employment attorney on the other side is going to do is say, okay, start documenting. And then you might notice that, hey, wait a minute, I'm starting to get more negative performance reviews, or I'm placed on a performance improvement plan or something like that. Once you get put on a PIP, that's really kind of the nail in the coffin, that there isn't really much coming back from that. And that's the kind of situation where you're hoping that you have made consistent complaints of your grievances prior to being on the performance improvement plan. So if you're having any issues at work with, like, let's say scheduling, sometimes people have problems because maybe they only have like one car, or like a kid gets sick and they don't have a babysitter or something, and you've only got a certain amount of points. Well, depending on what the situation is, that might be covered under one of these laws. If you have to take care of a sick spouse, a sick parent, that might be covered under FMLA. And they might be required to say, hey, wait a minute, I noticed that you're going to have to maybe take some time off here and there. What they're supposed to do is offer you FMLA. But now you know that if you run into one of those situations regarding, like, maybe taking care of a sick person, or if you realize that you're going to be off for an extended period of time for a medical issue, you should bring that up to them. You should be like, hey, do we have a policy about medical leave? And you should follow up with them afterwards. If they said, no, we don't, or, well, you have to take, you know, PTO time off before you qualify for FMLA. You know, that's when you send an email saying, well, are you really sure? Because the policy says this, and I just want, you know, clarification. And I really would, you know, feel more comfortable if somebody would, you know, talk to me about this. You know, is there somebody that I could talk to? A lot of times also, depending on the size of your company, there is the internal HR with that office, like that branch. But then if it's a national company, there's also going to be a national hotline or maybe a third party reporting agency that takes calls. There'll be like a number that may or may not be obvious in the employment manual, but that's something you need to know. You need to know whether or not there is an outside reporting agency that you report your grievances to. If there is one, then again, same thing, call that number and make a record of it. You know, if they give you a reference number, get a reference number, get the name of the person you're talking to. Just like if you were trying to, you know, return, I don't know, a sweater, and you got it online, you know, you want to have as much information as possible to prove that, you know, A, you bought the thing, and two, you know, you've been following these steps. Ultimately, like if you show that you are not that you're just trying to resolve the situation and trying to, you know, be the best employee that they can have, you know, once the situation's going, a lot of times they will try to correct the situation. Unfortunately, a lot of times they won't. A lot of times this sort of situation comes up where all of a sudden there is an issue. It usually revolves around some kind of workplace. So let's say you get injured at work, you have to file for workers' comp, and then all of a sudden you return to work. You may not have reached what they call maximum medical improvement, meaning that, you know, you're not back to kind of close to where you were before. And then what you're asking for them to do is, you know, accommodate your restrictions while you do continue to improve. A lot of times that's where the problems arise. It'll be like, oh, well, we can kind of accommodate them. Then they get tired of doing that because you're being paid to not really do the position that they need you to do, but they still can't really get rid of you. And they might just blatantly discriminate. You know, sometimes it does happen. Sometimes it's, you know, right on its face. A lot of times it's a lot more sinister. The cases that I deal with are all circumstantial. Very rarely is this that one email that it's like, hey, you know, Josh is really causing problems. We got to get rid of him, and the reason we're getting rid of him is one of these protective reasons. That never happens. So it's just something to look at. And I think if I have any sort of advice to give, it's one, if you think there's a problem, there probably is. And two, talking to a lawyer about it doesn't hurt. Doesn't mean they're going to sue. Doesn't mean that, you know, they'll find out about it or whatever. But if you have like my card will be, or my information will be put out. It doesn't cost anything to call me and say, hey, you know, I've got this issue. You know, that's part of my job. You know, not every case, not every person that walks in my office, am I going to immediately sign up and, okay, fine, let's start whatever. But that is something I recommend. And obviously it does not have to be that you do this. I mean, if there's somebody else, you know, that does this type of work, or even if they don't, you know, it doesn't hurt to ask, you know, like, hey, do you know about this? Does this seem right? You know, just to sort of at least, you know, kind of give you that peace of mind, at least to kind of maybe remind you like, hey, wait a minute, well, if you try doing this, or this, you know, to maybe be like, oh yeah, I didn't even think about that, or, oh, you're right. Now, a lot of people too realize that sometimes the situation is just intolerable. And sometimes it's like, I mean, there are certainly cases that I've dealt with where people could not be reasonably expected to continue working where they're working under those conditions. In those situations, it's tough. It's a tough call. You know, sometimes we tell our clients like, look, you know, you can file a charge of discrimination. You can, do those things, but that 100% puts a target on your back. And a lot of times it's just up to you. Does it make more sense? Is it something that I can live with? Yes, no. It's also good to remember that the best time to find a new job is when you already have a job. So don't be afraid to kind of explore options too. Like, hey, it seems like this is a good resource for bouncing ideas off of people. Like, hey, I'm interested in doing this. Anybody that's got openings in X, Y, and Z. Like, use the resources you have to sort of see if you can sort of self-correct. I know that's kind of a terrible. It sounds like just you got to take care of it on your own. But to a certain extent, you kind of do. You have to be your own best advocate, and you have to be the one that sort of you know what you're comfortable with, you know what you're not comfortable with. And there's a phrase that I use a lot in my practice, which is being right is overrated. And so even though you may be 100% right about the situation, that doesn't necessarily mean it's in your best interest to kind of rock the boat. Not to say that you shouldn't, but that is definitely something that you should consider. Because like I said in the beginning, HR is not there to help. HR is only there to protect the company. So they don't tell them information. A lot of times I have this problem too, where people think that they'll be like friends with HR or friends with their superiors, and they'll like disclose information. 99% of the time that comes back to negatively impact what's going on. So, keep it friendly, but also keep it professional. And
Josh, sorry, I to cut you off, but what kind of information has come back to bite people?
Like personal problems with their family.
Okay.
A lot of times, so one of the elements in our cases is emotional distress. So if you're experiencing some kind of trauma associated with, let's say you're just going through a rough patch with your kids, or rough patch with your parents, rough patch with your spouse, or whatever, boyfriend, girlfriend, whoever, or your dog died, or something's making you sad or upset. They will then come back and say, well, no, you're not really upset about losing your job. You're upset that, you were, your dog got run over, or that your husband was cheating on you, or that your kids are on drugs. I'm saying that it could be anything like that. And believe me, that's the kind of stuff that comes up.
That's shocking. I didn't know that.
Yeah. I remember one specific case where, it was very clear that they're like, they tried to use that against my client. Granted, it may not have come in at trial, but it certainly was coming in at a deposition, and certainly was, designed to make my client feel uncomfortable. Because that's another thing that's important to realize, that a lot of times there is what I call the gut punch that you experience after you have any type of this behavior. And one, you've already been essentially violated at work because you're being, experiencing some kind of discrimination or harassment or something. So you're already feeling down, and then all of a sudden the people that you think are there to protect you are not there to protect you, and you might feel betrayed by the entire incident. There are a few instances where I would say that you absolutely 100% do not take no for an answer, and do not let the situation become unresolved. And workplace violence and any type of sexual harassment. Those are the two instances where employers will try to sort of sweep it under the rug. And that's something where you want to 100%, make it known. And I have seen this too, not to have too many anecdotes, but I had a client she was really young. I think she's about like 19. She was working at a restaurant, and she was assaulted in a cooler by this other employee who had a history of, like throwing plates and being violent, and just, being just a not nice dude. Like, no reason why he should have been still employed there. her female manager, essentially said, well, I don't think she really reacted like somebody that would have just attacked. So that's why I didn't really take it seriously. And so that kind of stuff, and that happened just a few years ago. That stuff happens. I have another client who's 16 who, was in a cooler again. And a guy who was like in his 20s.
A cooler?
Like, what? A cooler in a restaurant.
Okay.
Yeah. And he just let his pants. And she's like, what are you doing? He's like, I think you know. And she told the manager, and she's like, oh, that's just so-and-so being so-and-so, which is completely unacceptable. It's not that, in no universe is that okay.
Right.
So those are the types of situations where it's very obvious that, no, you need to do something. And if something like that does happen to you, you need to immediately report it. Now, if there is actual touching, like somebody actually grabs you or, does something more than just words, then even the Eighth Circuit will say that, hey, wait a minute, that might be a bridge too far. Sometimes it's like, okay, it does take the actual physical contact for them to recognize that, oh, that might be harassment, or at least that's, those are federal judges. But
anecdotes are good, Josh, because I think the more stories you tell, I think people will be able to tell from that, oh, okay,
yeah, I mean,
feel free
it can
share.
be anything from just a micro aggression to where all of a sudden you see that maybe the Caucasian manager is shifting all of the good sales calls to the other Caucasians, or you might actually see where, other, like a minority might be treated differently than you are, or than a non-minority for, something that doesn't seem necessarily like it's a big deal, but it might become a big deal. Like, oh, they allow so-and-so to come in late. Or, oh, they allow so-and-so to, take off time to go get their kids or something like that. But when I did it, I got points or something. Those are the kinds of things where it might not be obvious, but it is, you're treated differently based on based on a protected status.
So
now,
we have a question.
Sure.
Sorry. So what if you don't have an HR department at your job? Like you're one of 2 or 3 employees. What steps do you take to report or deal with
then
workplace
unfortunately, you're
discrimination?
not really protected. You 2 or 3 employees, you're not protected under the law for, it might depend. I think that it would depend on the contact. Now, there are other laws that aren't necessarily
You're at
associated.
working for a gas station or something like that.
Okay, so you're working for, that's
or
another
small
one.
business.
Yeah, small business. You're working for a gas station. I think that you can, depending on what happened. Like if you get hurt at work because another employee attacks you, well, then that's a work comp case. If you and also too, if your employer might have other businesses that are closer, like let's say the gas station you work at only has 2 employees, but there's 10 gas stations with 2 employees, then that might create protection in those situations. Unfortunately, my advice, like if it's a small business, is you're going to need to find a safe place to work that isn't there. But doesn't necessarily mean that your employer won't do the right thing. Like if there's no HR place, and if you're like a good, consistent employee, but they know that, Jimmy or Jane or whatever is just kind of a screwball, and, they're not a good employee, then they might be like, all right, see ya, take it later. I mean, you won't know until you ask, but you'll know pretty quick once you do whether or not it's going to be receptive and not receptive. And I think that if you're in one of those situations where it's a smaller place, like have a backup plan before you start. Additionally, it's really important to realize that there are time limits for a lot of these causes of action. So that's when you probably do want to talk to an attorney. And if you are worried about whether or not you're covered by the law or not covered by the law, that is another good time to talk to an attorney, because they might say, okay, well, you don't qualify for this, this, and this, but maybe it's like, maybe there's a wage hour issue, maybe there's some other type of issue that that it might be protected by. And so, and I'm not super familiar with like OSHA, but there are provisions for like workplace violence for OSHA, but it has to be filed within like 30 days. So that's something to keep in mind. So the best thing to do is that once it happens, if you don't get a result within 5 days, then you might want to talk to an attorney and see if there's something that you can do, because that will give the attorney enough time if they do need to file something within a strict time limit to be able to advise you about what to do. So I know that's not a great answer.
Can you have your lawyer with you when you're talking to the HR?
Not usually. A lot of times they won't even allow it. A lot of times during internal investigations, they will not allow the employee to have a lawyer. There's really no.
Can an attorney contact HR on your behalf?
An attorney can do that, but it isn't necessarily going to. That's like going from like 1 to 100, like right away.
Okay.
And it's better if. So it's so dumb, but a lot of times you're sort of you're one of the other things that you're trying to avoid when you're actually in litigation is to look like you were planning on litigating. And it's kind of like you're trying to do the right thing, but at the same time there's a perception that, oh, wait a minute, you're only doing this to make a quick buck. And I mean, Missouri is very strange. There are a large amount of people in this state that do not believe in laws. They're like, no way, no how, never would I sue anybody. That's just not who I am. Jesus doesn't want me to sue. And it's a strange phenomenon, but those are also your juries. So you have to be aware of that. You have to be aware that once there's a problem, like the spotlight's on you. And I don't mean to say this to worry anybody, but just to make you aware that you have to take it seriously and you have to be consistent. Don't take no from a person that can't give you a yes. And that's why you kind of have to keep moving without being pushy, but being consistent, if that makes sense. And a lot of times, I'm not a complainer, believe it or not. I mean, even though this is what I do, like I hate returning things to stores, hate complaining about food. I do not like to complain. But if somebody is doing something that is clearly illegal or and also I am unsafe or I'm being treated differently, based on some protected activity, just because the world is full of jerks, that's worth talking to HR about. And I think that what I really want to emphasize is that it's not just a one-time conversation. It is a consistent conversation with documentation that the conversation was had. If you don't have access to email, get a free email you can use at the library or something like that, so that you have an electronic record of it. Text. If you do text, if you do email, save the emails, like print them out, save them, retain them. You'll need them.
So Josh, CAIR deals with a lot of people who are dealing with discrimination based on national origin, religion,
Right.
race. So what are the most important steps that they need to take to preserve their case if they feel like they're not getting anywhere with HR?
If they're not getting along with HR, probably the most important thing to do, like I said before, is to document it. And see if there are coworkers that will vouch for them, like, people that will say stuff, be willing to say stuff. I would say that number one, probably the most important thing to do is talk to an attorney. That's number one. But prior to talking to an attorney, prior to having a problem with HR, the number one thing to do is to know what the policies are. So what are the policies at my company? What do I need to do to make sure that they follow these policies? If they're not following the policies, then you know, you might need to report that to somebody else. Like find out if there's a different outside agency that might be interested. And a lot of companies, you know, to their credit, really want to try to have an inclusive environment. They really do value diversity. And they want to be inclusive. And so if the people that aren't on the like the local level find out about it, they can you know, they can kind of sometimes set them straight. So local HR is a good place to start. But then if you're not getting what you need from them, you need to find somebody else to talk. Whether it's an attorney, whether it's like a national HR, whether it's their boss, whether, you know, it's the boss of the company, you know, you just have to be consistent and consistent in a way that isn't, you know, I don't know any way to not make it seem like you're going to be pushy, because really that's what you're doing. But it's a justified assertiveness, which some people find offensive for some reason. I don't know why, but you really just kind of have to be your own best advocate. You know, and it's a lot like, you know, see something, say something, you know, and also doing that internal calculation about, all right, well, is this something I can live with? Is this job more important than my feelings? You know, I mean, sometimes people have to do that. But yeah.
One question we got is, are employers required to have a policy or a handbook?
It depends.
Okay.
It depends on their size. It depends on a lot of times you'll notice, like if you're in the break room, there'll be like a poster on the wall that'll have like, okay, these are your rights under this. If you're less than 6, I'd say, then maybe not. You may not have a policy at all. You may not even have an HR department. But what they are required to do is follow the law. So if you've got you know, a 60 employee firm or 60 employee business, and they have an employee that's been over there for longer than a year, and that employee needs to take medical leave. If they say no, then they could be in violation of FMLA, whether or not they have a policy about it or not. Same thing, if you've got more than 6 employees or 6 or more employees, then all of a sudden you start you know, discriminating against your employees based on, you know, religion or sex or race or whatever, that's going to be a problem under Missouri law. If you got 12 or more, it's going to be a problem under federal law. So, yeah, so a lot of it just depends on the size of your company, and that's the part that's kind of really frustrating, is why do some organizations have a license to discriminate? Like in Missouri, if you were a religious organization, you were exempt from the Missouri Human Rights Act. So the MCHR won't even investigate your claim. So you have
private schools with religious affiliation, they're exempt?
Some, yeah.
So then what do you do?
Federal law.
Then you have to go under the federal law. Oh my God, I did not know that. Okay.
Yeah, and it depends. I mean, a lot of times too, you might be able to fight it. Like one of the problems you run into is like hospitals be like, you know, Saint whatever, and there's like no, like it's got like a loose religious affiliation, but there may be no, and I don't remember because I haven't really run into this in a while, like what the actual requirements are, but it might be like so and so's on the board of something. So, like they may have a priest on the board or something. It's really loosey goosey. I mean, but the basis, I mean, basically, if there's a saint in front of it, there's a chance that it is exempt.
Wow. So then universities that have religious affiliations and stuff.
Yeah,
that would-
I'm actually suing SLU right now. And
Oh, tell us more about that.
well, it was I filed a charge of discrimination because I represented an African American, or I represent an African American pharmacist who made complaints about discrimination, and he was essentially denied promotion because of the way he communicated, which is, to me, is just code for he was Black. But if you listen to him, and I mean, it's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Like, I mean, he doesn't even have, like, I think I have more of an accent than he does. So, it was basically, he was denied the promotion, and then he was terminated for, I guess, alleged unprofessional behavior because somebody like came up, and I guess they got an argument over the phone, and there was some other employee. It's dumb, but the result is, and it's not like a slam dunk case by any means, but that's the kind of stuff that I'll deal with, where it'll be like, maybe it's overt, maybe it's not, but it's just, you pick up on things. Like if somebody says, oh wow, you really sound ethnic, or oh wow, I'm surprised that you could jump so high being white, or I'm surprised that I mean, just things like that, where it might be like an offhand comment or whatever, and you're like, huh? But then you start to notice other things. Like, I mean, I've had clients at places where they give clients nickname, or they give employees nicknames, like they'll have an Hispanic worker, they'll name him Taco, or something just completely ridiculous. So, I mean, and I've had, other clients, other people come in and be like, yeah, I was, this one guy kept accusing me. I think you may have had the same situation where the guy, he was accused of, bomb maker or something like that. I mean, it was just, yeah.
Right.
So, but I mean, what I'm saying is, like, I remember you telling me that story, and I'm like, oh wait, I had a client where something similar happened to. So it's prevalent. I mean, it is
Right.
not something that doesn't happen.
Right.
Because people are stupid.
It's interesting you bring this up, because I was listening to a CLE by Michael Downey. You might know who he is, the ethics attorney in this area. And he was talking about microaggressions and stuff at work. And one of the things that came up, and I have seen and heard this happen, like it'll be a person of color and someone will be like, oh, you speak English really well. Like, how long have you been in this country? And they're like, I was born here. I'm American.
Right.
So things
right,
like
exactly.
that,
Yeah.
or when did you move to this country? It's like, I've always been here.
Right.
So.
And yeah, and so that's a big that's a big problem. That's and also too, if you are, but it shouldn't. I mean, the reality is that it should not make point blank. It really shouldn't, and it's not funny. It's not it's not cute when somebody like makes fun of an employee. And I mean, I see it all the time. I mean, it's usually with like, the people, they think they're joking around, like, oh, I didn't mean anything by it, blah, blah, blah. But, once they know that, hey, don't do that, it shouldn't happen again, and if it does, that's kind of a problem.
I have a question. When you say like people are joking around, when do you know when to react and when not to react?
Well, a lot of it is whether or not you're offended. I mean, if you've got like a dark sense of humor, and somebody, says something like off color, you might be like, oh, okay, I didn't feel like any venom, or, I did not find that patently offensive. But, I guess it's just, you can kind of tell. I mean, a lot of times, if it's upsetting you, like if you let someone say, somebody says a joke and you're just like, ha ha ha, whatever, and you're like, but then you keep thinking about it and you're like, well, wait a minute, that's not really that funny. And I know, everybody every now and then will kind of feel self-righteous, I know that sometimes, I'll be like, I can't believe that this happened. That's not funny. I'm not laughing at any of this. But at the same time, I'm kind of like, well, should I really take X, Y, or Z seriously? I think that that's a personal decision. I mean, there's certain things, that are just not okay.
Because you mentioned
Anybody like that, that.
Because you mentioned that whole like the white man can't jump. That was actually a movie.
No, it actually, it 100%
I
was.
remember from when I was a kid. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah,
it 100%
yeah.
was, but at the same
Yeah.
time, is it appropriate to make those kind of comments in a professional setting? Like if you're out and about, like with your friends and, they say something like that, that may or may not be offensive, but I mean, I don't think that any of that is really appropriate in the workplace. I mean, in the workplace, you should not be exposed to really any of that kind of banter. And if it bothers you, and if it's against the policy, because it probably is, you should say, hey guys, I mean, just have a conversation with your coworker. Just like, hey, that's not really funny. I just, I'd rather you just not say anything. I'd rather just kind of keep everything,
Yeah.
friendly, but let's just not. Yeah.
I
I mean, here's the other thing too. Like nobody wants to be called a racist. Nobody likes how that feels. And so you got to remember that the person that you're complaining about or complaining to, they will immediately be defensive. They will immediately be like, oh, I wouldn't do, no, I don't, I didn't mean that.
That's not what I meant.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Be like, okay, that's fine. I'm just saying, in the future, like that might be a good way to approach it too. It's like, look, I don't know. I don't think that you're a bad person. I don't think that you're mean or whatever, but I'm just saying, like, this is concerning to me. And I just would appreciate that you don't make those comments.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll tell you something interesting. I've gone to court a few times, and this was in a smaller county in Illinois, but I walked into the courthouse and I'm going through security and they're like, oh, so where's your lawyer? What case are you here for? I'm like, no, I'm the attorney. So, I mean, I don't think people meant it in any way, but yeah, if you go up to a smaller like Central Illinois, where people of color are minorities, and I don't think they have as many women attorneys. I was like a huge novelty out there.
Right.
So,
well, that's I've seen that like forever, where they'll be like, oh, are you the court reporter? No, I'm the attorney.
Or I mean, I did an internship in the Cook County Public Defender's Office up in Chicago, and it's a very diverse area, and there'd be attorneys who are Black or Hispanic and stuff, and the security would be making them go through extra security, and they'd have their like card. They're like, no, we're the lawyers, So it happens. Like microaggressions these types of things happen all the time.
No, they absolutely do. And it's kind of like, I mean, part of it is like when you deal with stuff like that, I mean, that would really just kind of be a public accommodation issue. Is it worth it in those situations? Like, I don't know. I mean, if you feel like your ability to practice law or your ability to do your job is being affected by these issues, then 100% you should say something. But you should also realize that there might be repercussions. And I think that's just kind of, I don't want to scare anybody away from saying anything. That is certainly not my intent. But it's blame the victim all day long in these situations. And that's just how it's going to be.
Another question we have is, can you share some of the success stories you've had, like cases where someone has experienced racial discrimination or national origin discrimination, you sued the employer?
Yeah, sure. I can't talk about like the actual results because all that stuff is confidential. Because employers don't want to publicize that they had to pay money because they were.
Or you can say, I had a good outcome.
Right, I had a good outcome. One of which I had a good outcome with my client that was assaulted in the freezer. I had a good outcome with that because they saw that, hey, this is going to be a problem when this employee was there for a long time, had been disciplined a long time, and they allowed him to stay, and then he became increasingly aggressive. So that was one. Another one I just had, I got a good outcome from a client because there was a witness who was willing to write a statement saying, oh yeah, they 100% did this. And then now there's a third party that's disinterested, that's admitted that, and that was an FMLA violation where they said, oh yeah, you didn't get this promotion because you keep taking FMLA, which was just incredibly dumb. You know, they did that. I'm trying to think. A lot of I had another one where this was a case where there were a lot of tangential issues, and also one of those cases where the client had talked to HR and there had been a problem, and so she was a supervisor. She reported to HR that she'd been noticing a number of problems, and she gave a list of names. And it just so happened that those people like come to her that day because they knew that she was going to HR with problems that she had. And so she said, okay, well, I've noticed that this person had a problem. She also included people that HR already knew about that had, as examples of this. And so HR then fired her for not bringing the complaint sooner. And she's explained, like, I just did this. And so that case where they kind of got in a trick box because they subjected themselves to the federal statute where there's no cap on damages. And part of the way that statute reads is that if you discriminate against somebody who is complaining about racial discrimination, then you're also liable. And there were other issues with that case, but ultimately why those cases were successful is because there was documentation. There was some record of the complaints and inaction on the part of. So and so that's kind of why I thought that it would be important, because by the time somebody gets to me, I can't do anything about what happened before. I can only help them, navigate forward. So we're stuck with the facts we have before you get to me, and hopefully they're good facts. I mean, hopefully, yeah, I reported this. Hopefully I complained. Hopefully, you did X, Y, and Z. So I mean, yes. So does it happen where you get like where employers come correct? Yes, that happens. In fact, I think that the majority of these cases do have favorable results. Sometimes you hear about them in the news, and this wasn't my case, but there was one, I think recently, it was in the county, it was like $28 million. Somebody got that police officer was discriminated based on sexual orientation, and so that's kind of like that's a weird area of law too, where it's protected federally but not in the state, but it's what they protect is gender stereotypes. So if somebody said, hey, you dress awfully like a man and you're a woman, then that's protected. What they're, but if they're saying that, oh, you look like a lesbian, that is not in the state. It's crazy. So unless, they say, well, what do you mean by I look like a lesbian? You'd be like, well, you look like a man. Whatever, as long as it crosses over to a gender stereotype, then that is protected in the state. Now, the federal law was written by, the opinion was actually written by one of the conservative justices, and I was amazed. I was like, what was this guy smoking when he wrote it? Because it's correct. I mean, he got it right. So, yeah, it's a crapshoot.
We have a question. Someone was saying, what would you suggest, like, just a couple of lines. If you want to make a complaint to HR, how do you suggest wording that email or?
Okay, so I would say that, you know, I noticed that, I mean, I would probably start it off with, you know, hey, can I come in and talk to you about an issue I'm having? And then, you know, they might say, oh, what's the issue? And be like, well, you know, I feel like this might violate a policy. I'm not quite sure, but this is what's happened to me. And say, you know, when it happened, what happened exactly. This is my concern. Can I get a copy of the handbook? If you already have a copy of the handbook, be like, look, I don't think this is allowed in the handbook. It made me really uncomfortable. You know, can I talk? And then after that meeting, that's when you say, okay, we talked. You know, this is how we're going to resolve the situation. During the meeting, you might want to bring up, you're like, hey, I'm really worried that, you know, like, hey, maybe I'm new here, or hey, you know, I know this employee's been here a long time. I'm worried that the supervisor is going to retaliate against me or something, you know, like that's one of my concerns. And they'll usually say, oh no, that's absolutely prohibited. And then your follow-up email, you're like, yeah, you know, and you know, thank you for reassuring me that I wouldn't be retaliated against. Thanks for, you know, in that way, it's kind of put in writing that they said, oh, you won't be retaliated against. But that's kind of how I would approach it, is if you have a copy of the manual, read the manual, figure out what you need to do, because a lot of times it's like step, like where you have to confront the person that's upset you and try to resolve it. And if that doesn't work, then you go and talk to your supervisor. And if that doesn't work, then you go talk to their supervisor. And if that doesn't work, then you can talk to HR. And if that doesn't work, then there's a number that you should call, like, but only between these hours or whatever. And if you don't do all those things, then you haven't followed the procedure. Which doesn't mean that they win, but it's just there to prevent you. It's to deter you from doing it. It's making you jump through hoops to try to resolve a situation that should be just a phone, you know, just a conversation. So and so did this, it was wrong. Okay, we'll take care of it.
You had mentioned something about that she should have reported earlier. Is there like a timeline on when to report?
You don't want to sit on it. If it happens, hopefully within like a day or so. I mean, sometimes it's understandable, like, hey, you're not like if you're experiencing some kind of assault or something, it's normal that you're not necessarily going to report that immediately. Yeah. I mean, you've got other stuff to worry about at that point. You know, also too, I should bring this up. A lot of times, these situations can be, you know, for lack of a better word, traumatizing, and you might seek help from somebody else to like talk about it. So in Missouri, there's two different types of damages regarding emotional distress. There is garden variety emotional distress, which is kind of like the gut punch that anybody feels when it's happening. And there's severe emotional distress, which encompasses some sort of physical manifestation of the emotional distress, where you usually see a doctor or a psychologist, psychiatrist, or whatever. If you do eventually, like, let's say things don't work out with HR and you do eventually sue and you do seek emotional distress damages, it's important to know that anything you said to that doctor is your entire psychological history is an open book there. Some people are okay with it, some people are not okay with it, but it's important to realize that you know, you're being watched. Oh, and this is probably another thing that's like super, super, super important. Social media. Do not post anything on social media. Don't post about.
I was gonna ask that.
Yeah.
100%. Like, stay away from social media. Because it's discoverable. It's never going to turn out well. You know, just realize. I mean, I know that it's really impossible to say, hey, don't follow your friends on the Insta Talk or whatever it is the kids do. You know, maybe that's how you keep in touch with like your siblings or their kids, or I mean, that's what I do. that's how I keep track of my nieces and nephews is the Facebook. Just realize that, anything you say on there or do on there could be and will be held against you.
You bring up an interesting point, because that's one of the pieces of advice I give to my clients, and I'm a family law attorney, and you would not believe the stuff they put up there, and then it comes in and works against them. So yeah, it's a good point. Do undocumented people have rights?
I am not sure what exactly that is. That is precarious, because that is essentially, you do have rights as a person. Do you have rights then that won't mean that you want to, like ICE won't pick you up? Is it still ICE now?
You, yeah.
Yeah. Yes. So that's a lot of, I don't know really. I've never really had that issue. But that is something I would be happy to look into and follow up. My initial gut reaction is that they probably are covered by these laws. The problem though is that going to matter if you're immediately detained? I think it would depend on what your status is. Your employer's not going to theoretically they should get in more trouble than you for hiring an undocumented person if it is violating some law, but it's not how it works. You punish the person, that don't punish the corporation. They might have a fine, but I think that, and maybe that's going to change, but I don't know. I've never really come into a good situation where that's come up, because it will be used against you. I remember specifically, I had one case, it was an auto accident case in Chicago years and years and years ago, where she was suing for, I think she was suing for lost wages as well. So they're like, okay, fine. And all of a sudden her social security number didn't match the other one, or there was no record of her or whatever. And they brought it up at the deposition. They're just like, I don't know if, she's got the, intestinal fortitude to do. They're basically saying, yeah, we're going to report her. You don't settle. And, it's a tough situation. Hopefully, God, I don't know. That's like a nightmare scenario. I don't know.
I was just curious. Yeah, because there are undocumented people walking around.
No, they are. They should not be treated any differently.
Right.
But that just creates, like, I think the danger, the real danger, and something you'd have to advise. I'd have to advise my client and be like, okay, if you put yourself on the radar, you are on the radar, and that might not be what you want. So
yeah,
that's the bigger danger in my mind.
But wouldn't the organization or the company would also be in trouble for hiring an undocumented?
Well, that's what I'm saying, is that a lot of times you hear this with like food processing plants or something, where like, oh, we just raided a chicken factory or whatever, and there were 100 undocumented people there.
Oh my God.
What happens to the company? They might get like a small fine, and they're back hiring cheap unprotected labor right away. It's not how, so it's not, and then, the other people, they may have been here for 20 years or whatever, and then they've got to be sent back to a country they've never really been in. So, I guess it just depends. I don't know, but the company itself, that's not the problem. The company is probably like, they'll be like, well, how are we supposed to know? But by then it doesn't do you any good, because you're on the radar, and there's no two wrongs make a right, with that. So.
Do you have any more questions, Suma?
No. Oh, one more. How has the Me Too movement affected like labor and employment, like claims that you're getting as an attorney?
It's affected it positively and negatively at the same time. I think that right now we're experiencing a lot of backlash from Me Too. I think that for a while, there was a lot of, I think that anytime you bring awareness to like, this is a lot more prevalent than you think, because I don't, I mean, all of my female friends, I think that maybe one of them out of however many doesn't have a story about being sexually harassed. I mean, it happens all the time, and to varying degrees. And so it's like something that is definitely needs attention, and it kind of exposed it. But I think that it also created a bit of backlash in more conservative areas where they're like, oh, well, what do you mean I can't go, slap my secretary's butt or whatever? I've been doing the same thing for 30 years, or I'm just a friendly guy, I mean, just stupid stuff that people just don't want to accept change, and don't want to be told that they've been doing something wrong, something that's offensive, when I mean, realistically, you should know better. I mean, I'm constantly amazed at how just horrible people will react. But again, I mean, it's I guess if I was going to summarize, I think that it's been a positive change on the cases. I think that we still have a lot of bad law in the 8th Circuit, and also in state court. I think that people are realizing that, hey, wait a minute. Oh,
Yeah.
do this stuff in the workplace.
So I have a question, and it's a little touchy, but supposing like you work at a place and your employer does something that is against your beliefs. It's like someone was saying, someone put up a pride flag and they're not comfortable with that in the workplace. Like, what do you do?
Nothing. Like, I mean, that in that situation, you kind
Or
of
is the
have
goal
to
inclusivity? Like, if your beliefs are protected, then you have to protect other people's beliefs too.
You would think that, but
Okay.
it's not gonna turn out well. If a company has said, I mean, here's the thing: if a company has said that that if you're not specifically being discriminated against, like if you don't have, if they are not taking a if there's no negative employment decision based on that behavior, that isn't necessarily going to be actionable. You also have to realize that well, I mean, I guess you've got choices, it just depends. Like, if indeed, I think a more common problem that sort of comes up is, like, let's say they're trying to have like a holiday party, and all of a sudden there's just like Christmas shit everywhere. Then not everybody celebrates Christmas. You know what I mean? And so that might be something that you bring up to HR. But if a company is doing something like we're doing Pride or whatever, the reason that they're doing it is because it's important for the company to like think that they're going to like boost sales or do something like that. That's affecting their bottom line. And that's one of those cases where being right might be overrated. They're not going to take your side on 100%.
I mean, and I guess it goes back to your point of, do I really want to get into a lawsuit or a dispute about this or not?
Right. And that is not, if I would not die on that hill.
Okay. I mean, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Because there are some people who, I mean, and then you have the company, they're like, well, we want to show that we respect everyone. So.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And I mean, it really just depends. Like, if it's not, yeah, I mean, I think that the way to look at it is, how are you really being harmed by this? If you're not really being harmed by it, then are you harming somebody else by complaining? And if you're harming somebody else by complaining, if you look less reasonable than the other person, then you're probably going to lose your case, right, wrong,
Mhm.
whatever. That's
Mhm.
just how it probably. And I think that the again the problem with politics in the workplace, there really shouldn't be. I mean, you can talk about whatever you want in the workplace, I guess, but it's kind of like when you go to uh like maybe you haven't seen some relatives in a while, or they're distant relatives or whatever, there might be some conversations you want to avoid about, like, politics, religion, social issues, things like that. um if you realize that, yeah, that also works in the workplace. So I don't know. I mean, I think that's a real touchy issue, especially with like with the like the gender rights and all that stuff, and sexual orientation, stuff like that. That's tough. And I'm not really 100% sure if you're forced to like go and I don't know.
Attend a
I can't
specific
think of a
event, or
situation. I really
maybe,
can't think of
yeah.
a situation where you would be forced to participate or forced to,
Yeah.
do something. It's not like, them doing that is going to make you like, oh, now you have to be gay. If that was the case, if the employer says, all right, well, you have to be gay now, then obviously that's going to be
I
a
mean,
problem.
that would be very, yeah.
Yeah.
but I like
But I mean, I'm just putting up something. I mean, and I think the way the law works now is if your employer, I mean, here's something you might do. Be like, all right, well, I'd like a whatever your organization is flag put up. I mean, I still probably would not do that, but I think there was a recent case about that where they put up some flag in a common space, and then they had to put up another flag or something. And also realize too that it's discrimination based on religion, not I'm uncomfortable because of religion. I guess you
Mhm.
have to actually be discriminated against.
Right, so it has to hurt you in some way.
Yeah.
Right. There has to be
Yeah.
some kind of nexus
Damage.
between, yeah,
Mhm.
I guess that's.
I like the way you put it, that if it's not hurting you, then it's better to just let it go.
Yeah, well, I mean, and again, that comes down to like a personal decision. Like if this is something you strongly believe in, and you can show that you are suffering some harm because of it, then or treated differently because of it, then yeah, you should put a stop to it. I can think of I would think, okay, the example that comes to my mind is if like everybody's participating in I don't know, like the gay pride week or something, and then you're like, I'm not going to participate. They don't make you participate, but then all of a sudden people start treating you differently because you're not participating. In that
Or you
case,
get fired.
yeah, or something like
Yeah.
that. And in that case, you are being treated differently based on a belief that you may have.
Mm. Okay, so that's how the distinction comes in. Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
That's
that makes
good to know.
sense.
Yeah.
Do you have any questions, Uma?
No, I asked all that I got.
Yeah, same here. Well, thank you so much, Joshua. This was very informative, and
No
I
problem. And again, if anybody has any questions,
Mhm.
I'm sure they can get in touch with y'all. You can give my contact information. I'm happy to talk to, anybody about this stuff. Because I feel like an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure with these types of situations. And a lot of times it might just be a miscommunication. And if they had just done something, like if people had properly communicated in the first place, that could save a world of discomfort down the line.
yes.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.